Hello, today is Monday, October 21st, and welcome to episode 375 of Fault Lines, the National Securities Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI fellow Jessica Jones, and I'm joined today by, trumpeting NSI Advisory Board member Les Munson, NSI Senior Fellow Amy Mitchell, and NSI CTC, that Cyber and Tech Center Fellow, Jeffrey Wells. Okay. What we're talking about today. Last night, voters in Moldova cast their ballots in two crucial votes. One, a presidential election, and two, a referendum that would potentially affirm EU accession as an irreversible goal in the Moldovan constitution. Maia Sandu, who is the current kind of pro-Western president, was hoping to win a second term and get a yes on the referendum. So what happened? We've got some early results. Sandu won the first round, but she failed to win an outright majority, so she will face a Russian-friendly former prosecutor in a runoff in November. And the referendum passed, but not too much. So why are we tracking this kind of small country of 2 million people? It's, as you may know, a former state of part of the Soviet Union. It's neighbors with Ukraine, and it's kind of been tugged between the East and West for decades. Jeffrey, I might taint you a little bit for a history lesson. But earlier this year, Moldova actually began discussions to EU accession, though there's been some skepticism whether they'd meet the conditions to actually join the EU. This last election was a little bit fraught with a lot of allegations of Russian influence, attempts by Russian influence. Pro-Russian businessman, was accused of a voter buying scheme that could potentially have bribed up to 130,000 Moldovans, which is almost 10% of the population. It's all kinds of vandalism. There's been a lot of stories about Russians trying to attempt to influence selection. But even more so than that, speaking of Russian influence in the region, Moscow has about 1,500 troops actually stationed in Transnistria, a breakaway region with pro-Russian separatists that's been separated from Moldovan government's control for a long time now. And then earlier this year, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with the governor of a small autonomous region within Moldova called Gagauzia. Even with all that practice and hard work, I still messed that one up. Okay, so there's a lot to talk about here. Jeffrey, first I'm going to turn to you. Why are we talking about Moldova? Why is the EU following this? Why is the US? What's going on in this country?
Jess, thank you. And then last week, Les called me a wise sage, so I'm going to refer to the wise sages of the band Talking Heads, who wrote in the last century, "Same as it ever was, same as it ever was." One of the things, I spent some time in Moldova. One of their greatest regrets was that when they broke away, they became a neutral country, which really put them out of touch with the West and really the East. And they constantly have been struggling under the thumb of the Russians. And this, I'm going to liken this to the 16th century when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Muscovy, which was the precursor to Russia, locked horns over, more than just land. They fought over influence and ideology. Muscovy obviously pushed to the east while the Commonwealth planted its seeds in Western governance. Fast forward to today, and Moldova is playing out a similar script, same as it ever was. We're standing at the intersection of Europe's promises and Russia's bear's grasp. And back then, the hesitation cost the Commonwealth dearly, leaving Europe in Eastern Europe wide open for Russia's long march and crushing approach. Moldova's referendum squeaked by. I think it was 0.39%. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I think the fallout is set to ripple far beyond the borders for Russia and Moldova leaning west. It's not just a nuisance, it's existential for them. With the Kremlin eyeing this presidential runoff, expect more disruptions during trouble in Gagauzia, this time perhaps with more aliens and UFOs, so that could, advance for less, backing opposition figures and ramping up cyber meddling. And I think, a continued neutral Moldova buys Moscow time to dig deeper into Europe's edge, stall European Union expansion, and keep Ukraine bogged down. Russia's playing, the long game, grinding gears, not storming the gates here. And with Moldova caught between East and West, Kremlin is spreading discord and daring the West to flinch, and we probably will flinch. So, it's a 16th century strategy. No armies, just slow erosion, same as it ever was, same as it ever was.
Amy, what do you think? Jeffrey pointed out that the Moldovans may see this as an existential crisis. They border Ukraine. Ukraine obviously was invaded by Russia. Do you think they worry about their own prospects? It's to the same as it ever was playbook, Russia playing with these small regions to try to affect the larger geopolitical scene. How worried do you think they are about Russian influence and their own future?
Well, first, thank you. But I think that, I'm not going to go back to the 16th century like Jeffrey did, but I'm just going to try and time travel back to 2012, actually, when Russia hosted the Sochi Olympics. And if everyone recalls, during those Olympics, there was the former glory of the Soviet Union on display, right? The history that they had gone through over those last 80 years. And that's Putin's entire game plan right there. He laid it out for the world in the Olympics. Thank you. And, we see that shortly thereafter in 2014, when he first went into Crimea. He is looking for his former glory. And he wants to bring together the Soviet Union once again. And so from Moldova's perspective, they are worried. They're right on the border. And it's in the U.S. best interest to let our allies, whether it be Sandu in Moldova, Zelensky in Ukraine, do what you need to do to defend your territory and put a stop to the threat. And we've seen that being effectively that strategy effective with Israel. They're taking out everyone. They have recreated their deterrence in the Middle East, and we need to have that same level of deterrence in Europe, especially Eastern Europe and NATO. So from that perspective, I would say unless Putin is utterly, utterly defeated and hopefully gone, in the very near future, we're going to continue to see this threat. So it's in U.S. best interest to do that.
Les, I've got to ask you, because I need to hear you pronounce Gagauzia, obviously, on this show. What are your thoughts on what's going on? I mean, are you surprised, not surprised that the EU referendum squeaked by? Were you thinking there'd be a bigger victory or that it wouldn't pass?
It's a great question, Jones, and I think we ignore the Moldovan question at our peril. Our own Lady Gaga, of course, comes from Gagauzia. No, not really. I'm just joking. In all seriousness, I think that the politics of Moldova are fascinating. Even before Russia was interfering in Georgia and Ukraine, it was interfering in Moldova. It was one of the first countries to really be influenced by the kind of Russian corruption, election interference, and even troops on the ground. And yet, despite all of that, despite there being Russian troops in Moldova, I think for like the last 32 years in Transnistria in particular, the Moldovans voted to go with the West, right? And yes, it was by kind of a real small margin, but it's significant. Moldova is a teeny tiny country. It is poor. It is riven by corruption. It is utterly overwhelmed by the size of Russia and Russia's influence and Russia's military might and all of those things. But it still chooses to look to the West. So I think we should kind of keep that in mind as we're thinking about this long-term battle between East and West, and the idea that some have floated that it's really NATO's fault for expanding too much into Eastern Europe. I'm sorry, it's inevitable. That's what Eastern Europe wants. Eastern Europe looks to the West for a better model, even in a place like Moldova, where you would think it might make some sort of Machiavellian sense to cut a deal with the bear at their, to the north of them and find some way to accommodate what Moscow wants. That's not what the Moldovan people have chosen. They continually choose the West. It should ratify our beliefs in our own system. And I think it should galvanize our support for Ukraine. One of the reasons Moldova is interesting is because the third Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was an effort to connect eastern Ukraine and Crimea with Russian troops in Moldova. the Russians failed to do that because of the courage of Zelensky and the Ukrainians, with not nearly as much help from us as they deserved, but they were able to do that. Let's, we're doing pretty good here. We should be helping them a little bit more than we are, I think, both in Ukraine and Moldova. But I think very instructive that this vote came out our way.
Touch of positivity to wrap up this Monday episode. Thank you, Les Munson. That's a wrap. Thanks so much,
Happy
Devlin
Monday.
Burney, Claude Jennings, and the NSI team for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Wednesday, October 23rd, for another amazing episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Check us out on YouTube. You can see Jeffrey's challenge coin collection over his shoulder if you tune in there. So, and if you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, maybe rate your room for us, and subscribe.